Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of Flow Podcast. This is a new podcast channel on YouTube that I have started to hold conversations with the people you really want to hear from. And today we are very delighted to be speaking with Peyman Jafari, an assistant professor of history at William and Mary. He will be speaking on the question of Iran's revolt and what is different today, among a number of other matters that I am sure everyone at this point would like to get clarity on. First, let me welcome Peyman. Welcome, Peyman, to our first inaugural podcast.
Thank you. I'm very honored to be the first.
We are very excited to have you. I have been following you, not stalking you, but I've been following you on Twitter. And I really appreciated so much of your intervention on the topic. And we would love to start with this particular discussion on Iran. I don't think it's going to be the last. The title of this particular podcast is Iran in Revolt. What is different today? And we will start with the very quick logo of the podcast. Here we go. So, Peyman, before we start, if you would allow me to very briefly go ahead and say a few words about you, and of course, there's nothing that can describe any of us fully. However, this is a quick introductory biography of Peyman. Professor Peyman Jafari is assistant professor of history and international relations at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia, and he is a research fellow of the International Institute of Social History in Amsterdam. His research focuses on the relationship between empires, labor, and ecology in the global history of oil, the social history of revolutions, and the role of the labor movement in contemporary Iran. In addition to this, he is author. He's actually author of, well, I'm not going to be able to read this. Der an der Iran. I'm not sure what that means. And then I'm not going to attempt the subtitle. What is it? Something and Kultur?
Yeah, Gegenwart und Kultur. It's from culture and history of Iran.
Awesome. And he has co-edited 2 volumes, Iran in the Middle East, Transnational Encounters, and Social History. And as well, Worlds of Labor Turned Upside Down, Labor Relations and Revolutions in Global Perspective, which is something that I would like to get to in the conversation. His most recent publication is Labor in the Making of the International Relations of Oil, Resource Nationalism and Trade Unions in Roland Donruhor and Wojciech Ostrowski. Yes, editors, Handbook of Oil and International Relations. This was published in 2022. He is currently writing a monograph titled Oil and Labor in the Iranian Revolution, a social history of uneven and combined development. Peyman, we are very excited to have you on board, not least after reading your bio, which actually makes all of this even more enticing to speak with you. And before we get going, I'd like to ask you a question that has nothing to do with the podcast topic, and that is, how are you doing?
I'm doing fine. I mean, it is a very busy time teaching and also dealing with the Iran protests, both at an intellectual level, but also honestly, emotionally, because we are all engaged, supporting the protests in Iran and worried about those who have been arrested, worried about family. So it's an emotional time as well.
Absolutely. And as you well know, this was a very also tough decade for those of us following the region, experiencing similar, I would say, traumas as a result of the turmoil, death and destruction and so on. So I totally hear you, and thank you for making time to join us at a time like this. Let me start by asking you to contextualize for us basically what transpired in Iran over the past few weeks as a starting point.
Right, as a brief background, the protest started on 16th of September. That was the day that Mahsa Amini, an Iranian from Kurdish descent, died in police custody after the morality police in Iran had arrested her for not wearing the hijab according to the regulations. And people gathered in front of the hospital, but also in Saqqez, the Kurdish city in northwestern Iran. And it was the first moment that actually in Saqqez women pulled off their own headscarves, and also the slogan "Women, Life and Liberty" was raised, and then resonated actually throughout Iran. The protests in the following weeks. We are in the week now at the present, spread to more than 80 cities all across Iran. There have been many ups and downs in these last 8 weeks. We have seen moments that where the protests have been smaller at local level, at neighborhood level. And on other points, there have been huge mass demonstrations. For instance, the commemoration of the 40th day of the death of Mahsa Amini, there were mass protests. Unfortunately, there have been also very violent actions as well. For instance, on 30th of September, the massacre in Zahedan, that's the province of Baluchistan near the border of Pakistan in southeastern Iran, where the crackdown has been the most violent as well. I think going through these protests, there have been two constants, though, through these ebb and flows. I think universities have remained in between a focus of protests, keeping the fire going on, and also the Kurdish cities as well have been most intense in these protests.
Thank you very much for this, Peyman. I'm sure that the level of attention, which is what happened also in the cases of the Arab uprisings that we witnessed and followed so closely for 10 years, the attention that is given to events during the first weeks is far greater than what comes after. And this is one of the reasons I'm hoping that we could encapsulate as much as possible some of the developments that have transpired, especially that I would like to go back to the title and of this podcast and ask you as you move forward to tell us how different these protests that are occurring today from what took place in 2009 and at the end of 2018 in Iran? And is there reason to consider them to be different in kind, irrespective of what prompted them?
Right. I think there are a number of issues that make these protests very different. I think, first of all, the slogan that is really fueling them, right? Women, life, and freedom. It starts with women. And I think the women's issue, women's rights, has been always at the heart of many protests in Iran. Actually, immediately, even after the Iranian Revolution of 79, when Ayatollah Khomeini tried to actually introduce the compulsory veil. There were protests against the compulsory veil. And after that, decade in, decade out, that has actually continued. Women have resisted the compulsory veil in their daily lives. In the 1980s, when I lived in Iran, I really remember the black chadors and the conformity that everybody had to go through. And from the 1990s, through their daily struggles, women have actually pushed back the state and forcing it to allow them more flexibility and freedom in how they are wearing the veil, right? The veil going back and back more. But I do think that now women have found their collective action, and raising this demand as a political demand at the foreground of these protests is very crucial. I think this is one of the rare internationally uprisings in which women's rights is so central, and that's an important aspect. The second aspect is that this is an outcome of a longer, what I would call, cultural revolution that has been happening in Iran. And that's the paradox of the Islamic Republic, because I think it has, in one way, allowed more women to participate in public life. Universities, education have spread across small towns in Iran, but women have been confronted with these obstacles and barriers. So you get the contradiction, as it were, right? So they want to push through that contradiction. What else makes this different is, I think, in 2009 protests, that was very much about the fraudulent elections, right? So people were raising the slogan, "We want back our votes." It was very much a political demand of fair elections, reforms within the system. And in 2018 and 19, we had mass protests as well. Those were very much around socioeconomic demands. I don't want to make this into a huge issue because economic and political demands often fuse, but I'm talking about what was really the driving force in them. And what is different now is, I think, that all these issues are coming together, they are interlinked, and that is very visible in the slogan, women, life, and freedom. Life means a life free of social restrictions, of political restrictions, free of poverty and inequality. And that is, I think, why it has resonated and mobilized so many people. So an intersection of these slogans and grievances, I think. Another point I want to raise is, aligned with this changing of slogans and development of these intersections, is a stronger social coalition in these protests. Again, because in 2009, I think the driving force of the protests was the urban middle class, mainly in Tehran. We had a demonstration of 3 million people in Tehran. Like in any protest, there will be a diversity of people coming together. But when we talk about the dominance of a social group, we are talking about the dominance of the middle class in that period. And again, in 2018, 19, I think there were more the urban unemployed, the city dwellers, the city poor, very much coming together around those socioeconomic issues. And now we are seeing the younger generation that is bringing together both a new generation of the middle class that has grown up in the last decade in the Islamic Republic, together with the workers, unemployed, urban poor. So it is a still fragile coalition, but I think it is an important aspect. And I know I have been talking long, but if you allow me to raise a final point why these are different, is that I think the perspective of these movement, the nature of this movement. So in 2009, let me start a bit earlier. I think the social movements in Iran really started in the late 1990s, early 2000s, with what I call reformism from within. That was the moment that many people voted for reformist politicians, basically telling them, reform the system from within for us. We are voting for you. This is almost a blanco check. Please do it for us. They were disappointed in the following decade. And in 2009, we saw this shift to what I call reformism from the outside. People saying, okay, we don't trust you doing this. We are going to exert pressure on you through mass movements, mass protests to actually reform the system. And also that, of course, led to disillusionments and crackdowns by the state. And the outlook of the movement today is a revolutionary one, I would say. Many people on the street want to topple the system, want a radical change. And I should also stress that there is not a unilinear relationship and direction in these developments. These different outlooks exist parallel next to each other. I mean, the people who are at the foreground of the protests have that revolutionary outlook, but I do think that there are many people who are sitting in their houses sympathizing with the movement who are also for reforms.
Can you tell us a little bit about the state reaction in previous events, similar to what we have been witnessing? Much has depended on the nature of the reaction of the state. I know from the previous cases in the Arab world as well as in Iran, that actually shaped the cycle of state opposition dynamics and violence. How did the state react, and is that similar to what we have seen in Iran, or is it a bit more heavy-handed?
Right. Well, in general, states have two strategies in responding to these kind of protests, right? One is repression, one is concession. And often you see a incoherent mix of these two, as we saw, for instance, during the 1979 revolution. The regime of the Shah was very late with introducing concessions. And when they did, they were alternating these with concessions and repression, and that only accelerated actually the movement. And I do think that the current leadership in Iran, who participated in the revolution of 1979, has very much that experience. And what they are, I think, strategizing about is we shouldn't come too soon with any concessions, and definitely not being seen as giving concessions vis-a-vis the protests. So therefore, the first reaction always has been huge amount of repression. And that is what they have unleashed on the protests in the last 8 weeks. We have seen more than 350 people die, unfortunately, during these attacks of the police force on the protests. Several thousand people have been arrested. Among them, by the way, journalists who have been reporting on these protests. And at the moment, the Iranian parliament is discussing and pushing for the execution of a number of those who have been arrested, to basically intimidate people not to go onto the streets. Um, but I also should say, and this is kind of very sounds cynical, because this level of repression is already hard. But from the standpoint of the regime, they are acting in restraint. They have not mobilized all the repressive forces of the state. Who we are seeing on the streets are mainly the anti-riot police, the normal police, and the Basij militia forces. They have not brought the revolutionary guards, the elite members, with like with the weapons really to shoot on people, or let alone tanks or those kind of equipment on the street. So I think in the coming weeks we could see an increase of repression if the protests intensify as well. Bassam, I
Thank
can
you.
also say something about the concessions, though, because I
Yeah,
think that
please.
is the other element. Because we do see that the at the state level, a number of people are seeing that this situation cannot continue eternally. The protests, they have underestimated the rage in society. So they have to introduce some changes. And the debate is about when and how to do this. I don't think they will introduce these as the protests are ongoing. They will first want to crack down on the protests and maybe later introduce some of the concessions. Well, what are these concessions? We see some of the hints at the margins of the political elite at these. For instance, the head of the Supreme Council of the Cultural Revolution a few days ago announced that the morality police is actually not in their statutes, in their regulations. So there is no legal reason for the morality police to exist. And already a concession has been actually that the morality police on the street is less visible. Others have hinted to the disappearance of the morality police. The Islamic Heritage Organization a few days ago also came out with a report about religious views on compulsory hijab, in which they are discussing the ideas of many Iranian religious scholars and saying, well, there is a diversity of opinions in this. And maybe we should respect the diversity of opinions in Iranian society, right? So that's another hint that relaxation of those social restrictions might be down the line. Others have been talking about more major reforms, political reforms. For instance, the chair of parliament yesterday announced that, in line actually with the supreme leader's announcement of reforming the political system, more reforms might be needed. Well, Iranian population has obviously reacted very lukewarm to this, with lots of skepticism, because there has been lots of talk previously as well about these kind of reforms, and they have not materialized. And it has to be seen if the government has heard the voice of the people this time, and if they would want to introduce any significant reforms in the coming weeks and months.
Well, thank you. At this point, I'd like to address the elephant that might enter the room, because, I mean, or maybe it has already in some ways, and that is the question of external relations, interventions, and so on. As we have seen in the previous cases of uprisings, the external intervention, whether in the case of Bahrain by Saudi Arabia, or in the case of Syria by literally everyone and their mother on the side of the regime and the opposition, has not only complicated the situation, but actually produced a vastly counter-revolutionary outcome, which is one of the reasons why in Algeria, protesters on the streets were basically saying thanks but no thanks to any sort of intervention, knowing full well that its fate is likely to undermine the uprising, considering the kinds of
Right.
actors that intervene and the reasons for which they intervene. And of course, we're talking here about a number of countries, but first among them is the United States and some of the other countries in the region that have an interest in undermining the Egyptian regime, which ends up actually undermining the people themselves, as we saw in Iraq and Syria and beyond. How can we understand some of these potential prospects, and has there been to date any significant intervention of the sort?
Right. Let me first begin by how the Islamic Republic is always actually using this argument and abusing the situation by always saying that these protests are instigated by foreign powers, right? And that totally obviously undermines the agency of Iranian people, who have been really suffering in the last four decades by, you know, the political system, social inequalities, and so on. So there are legitimate reasons for Iranians to stand up for their rights. But well, as Woody Allen always said, like, you know, just because you're paranoid doesn't matter they are not following you. I do think that there is always foreign powers sitting to kind of take advantage of this situation for themselves and channelize the movement into their own direction. Because, first of all, Iran might seem isolated in terms of the movement. I mean, what is happening in Iran. Some people want to kind of exceptionalize this. What is happening in Iran is exceptional. This has to do with Islamic fundamentalism. This has to be to do with the mullahs and so on. There are many particularities to Iran, obviously. The kind of semi-theocratic system with electoral institutions and so on has created its own dynamics. But I think Iran is part of what is happening globally. And you can see the grievances of people in there as well. You see this reflected actually in the songs and the poetry and the slogans that are coming out of Iran. So they are resisting the compulsory veil, but this is also about women's bodies' autonomy, right? And therefore, you know, the foreign countries are not very keen on this, because even here in the U.S. there has been an attack on women's rights, right? Or if this slogan in Iran would continue and spread to the rest of the region, I think the autocrats in the region would be very much threatened as well. Or it is also the re-entry of people in popular and political discourse. We, the people, Iranians, are defining it, and I think that is definitely a threat to the foreign powers as well, the autocrats in the region. And therefore they are actually trying to interfere, and they do that through several channels. Saudi Arabia has been actually funding certain medias, Iran International TV, for instance, who are pushing a particular line, nostalgia for the previous monarchy, for instance, previous regime in Iran, to actually limit the political horizon of Iranians, not to go beyond what is permissible in current politics of global powers, in terms of actually challenging the economic logic underlying the Islamic Republic of Iran. And that is very neoliberal in terms of the privatizations, neoliberalization, the precarization of the labor force Iran, etc. Because that is actually would resonate with what is happening more in the region and globally as well. So therefore, they are really trying to restrict that. In the US, you see the same dynamics. They are pushing forward certain figures and names that are not representing the radical imaginaries of the Iranian protests, but would limit them within the confinements of neoliberal politics. Therefore, I can give you examples. The women who are always raised on political platforms ignore certain names. I want to mention and honor one of them, that is Leila Hossein-Zadeh, who is a leftist activist who has been imprisoned several times. Her name, unfortunately, doesn't make it into these media platforms. And a few days ago, in prison, she came when her family went to visit her. She was not wearing the veil because she said, you see, the resistance shouldn't be only in the street, it should be also here in prison as well. And those are acts of courage that should be really honored as well. And she has therefore also opposed, for instance, economic sanctions. And this is the other point I want to raise, because foreign intervention also goes through economic sanctions. And I have always argued that the point of economic sanctions is that it actually reinforces the most military and neoconservative forces in the Iranian regime, because the Revolutionary Guards basically controls the borders of Iran, the ports of Iran, and when the black market grows, they can actually make more profit because they have the forces to utilize these economic transactions. And also, it undermines the popular movement because the social fabric of the society starts to fall off. The civil society weakens. And that is what you need, not only to topple a regime, but actually ensure that it can be followed by a more democratic alternative. You need a vibrant civil society.
Thank you for addressing this really thorny topic. It's a topic that some might or might not know. We're addressing directly in a project titled at the Arab Studies Institute, titled "Navigating Anti-Authoritarianism and Anti-Imperialism," which comes to life right in front of our eyes today. And one of the things that I wanted to ask as a follow-up is it true also in this case that foreign intervention will strengthen the hand of the hardliners in Iran and kind of, unwittingly or unintentionally justify some of the discourse, such as in the case of Syria, when, of course, all the protesters were considered terrorists by the regime, like from the first day, even when they were like dancing on the streets and protesting in the most, creative, civil, artistic manner, they were still called terrorists. And then, of course, when the battlefield changed from this setting to a more violent, coercive setting, and foreign intervention, of course, played a major role in this. The regime was basically continuing its discourse as if nothing changed in the nature of the game, but it lent. At least for the regime, it lent credibility to their claims, whether or not these were legitimate. Is this the sort of concern that maybe people on the ground in Iran have today, that this sort of support, quote unquote, might actually be counterproductive?
Right. I think that's the case in Iran as well, because when there is foreign intervention, definitely militarily, economically, I think that allows the core of the regime to mobilize its forces. First of all, we do see that the social basis of the state has diminished in the last 4 decades, right? But they still do have a social base that supports them, and it is probably a minority, but a significant minority. When there would be a foreign intervention, that gives them credibility to mobilize and harden these kind of supporters, and also arm them to, in fact, crack down on the population. And then also there are others around this core of supporters who are kind of in between, don't know what the future will be. They are dealing with uncertainty. If you want, they are living between fear and hope. The hope of change, of bringing a secular democracy to Iran, but also the fear of infighting and the repetition of Syria or Libya, etc. Those people might become more afraid of those uncertainties and back down, and not, even if not supporting the regime, remain neutral, and therefore allowing the state to kind of repress the activists on the streets. And also, it would military intervention would allow the armed forces to ask for more money, as they have been doing, by the way, in the last years, as the tensions with the US has been rising. um, Arm themselves and really mobilize themselves ideologically and military. And unfortunately, there are those voices who are actually calling for this kind of military intervention, either very directly. Those are in the minority, however. Many, however, are using actually the economic sanctions and political intervention in Iran as a way of paving the way for a military intervention. Because Iranians, and many in the Middle East and globally, by the way, here in the US as well, are very wary and afraid of those scenarios of military interventions. We have the examples of Afghanistan, of Iraq and Syria, and so on. So therefore, they want to actually push this tension to a point that a military confrontation becomes unevitable. I can give examples of figureheads of some opposition figures of Iranian diaspora leading this kind of charge of saying, well, maybe at this point, maybe Israel could actually attack a number of nuclear facilities in Iran. Well, and that's a point when you really start to realize that these people do not give a damn about the future of Iranians. Because if you would attack militarily those nuclear facilities, who are going to be the victims? Those are the normally Iranians, the millions of Iranians who have to deal with the fallout of that kind of military attack. And therefore, I think any military intervention in Iran should be opposed, because it will benefit the regime and undermine the popular uprising, actually, that is ongoing in Iran.
Probably, no doubt. I mean, I also want to. I mean, we can talk about this quite a bit in terms of strategically what would be the position to hold in this situation. I mean, we have discussed this amply during the Arab uprisings, and now as well with this new project. And the idea is to oppose both, right? Foreign intervention and local forms of repression, all sorts of forms of repression, including a repressive regime and so on. But that's sort of a cop out. That, I mean, of course, we're supposed to oppose both. But then when there is a decision to make, and when there is a trade-off to make, this is when things become very dicey. And this is the sort of thing that we're hoping that we can develop better answers to in terms of maybe not those of us who are, looking in from the outside, but people on the ground. And speaking of people on the ground, I'd like to move to a very quick question that I wanted to ask based on your own research and work and what is happening today potentially in Iran, and that is, to what extent are we seeing labor movements or workers, unions, and other mass-based groupings mobilize, and is there a sort of indicator for when this might actually take things beyond a particular threshold, kind of like what happened in the Egyptian revolution when workers basically entered the fray.
Right. I think one of the positive elements of these protests have been that there has been lots of sympathy among workers with these protests, and we have seen even a number of strikes on a smaller level in a number of cities, among the Bazaris, for instance, and most crucially among a number of oil workers in southern Iran that started on 10th of October, but also ended very quickly with their arrest. So this has raised the question of what can a general strike or a mass strike do in Iran? Can it materialize? And I have argued that this would indeed be a huge game changer if the workers would enter the frame with mass strikes, paralyzing the state, increasing the confidence on the part of the protest movement. But I think there are serious obstacles to this development. One has been the level of organization, because the Islamic Republic, from immediately after the revolution, started cracking down on independent organizations of labor. Nevertheless, because the Iranian Revolution was a popular movement in which millions participated, it also had to allow a number of semi formal, semi state depending labor organizations. And for a number of decades, people could actually, through these kind of yellow unions, organize some level of negotiations, claim making, protests, and so on. I think that created some experienced cadres among the workers to kind of carry on their experience of the 1979 revolution and before with them. Parallel to those organizations, in the last 2 decades, we did see the emergence of a number of informal organizations, networks, and unions. For instance, the trade union of the Tehran bus drivers has been very important since 2003, 2005 in kind of organizing protests and strikes. Um, the Association of Teachers has been very important in organizing national strikes and protests. The organization of the Haftepe sugarcane factory workers in southern Iran, and also the organizations of the oil workers. I mean, informal have been very important. But the obstacle has been that the state really tries to prevent the formation of any national organization and any national coming together, convergence of these networks. The second obstacle has been basically the neoliberal assault on workers in Iran, the fragmentation of the workforce through outsourcing, through privatization, through the creation of the labor force organized in a core of permanent workers and a kind of periphery of contract workers. For instance, the oil workers I mentioned who went on strike, those were the contract workers. And therefore, the power that they could kind of exert was limited. These were not the permanent oil workers who are employed at the oil wells or in the refineries. So when those people would go on strike, that would be a huge advancement. So these are the obstacles. But I do think that if the protests continue, the debates among workers can continue, the organization can continue, and these obstacles can be overcome, especially, and I do want to also kind of provide from my own research, kind of suggestions of how this can be done. I think neighborhood level organizations are very important to actually draw together workers and the communities around them into support networks in order to support emergent strikes and so on. For instance, by gathering money for the strikers and making strike funds, etc.
Thank you, Peyman. Let me move to sort of the last area, and that is how would we compare what is going on today in Iran to what we witnessed in the cases of the Arab uprisings, as well as the 1979 revolution in Iran, even if, of course, the questions of scale here matter, because we still have not
Right.
gotten to the point where the scale is similar. But are there any signs of similarities that might actually develop into something of the sort?
Right. I think looking at similarities and differences between these moments is very important to also get a better understanding of what is happening now. So if you look at the Arab revolts of 2011, I think the main similarity is, I think these movements are about dignity, right? The frustration and anger among many Iranians is about the infringement of their human dignity. And I think this very much resonates with the Arab revolts. And I see there also potential. And I think it also boils down to people like us to kind of bridge the divide on what is happening in the Middle East between Iran, Turkey, and the Arab countries, of bringing into the discussion these points of how these solidarities could be strengthened, because there are lots of similarities. But there is also one potential similarity in a more negative way. As we saw in Egypt, for instance, the winner at the end was the military, right? Also, as you mentioned, through the intervention of Saudi Arabia and other foreign powers, the military came back and seized the power to create a transition. The reason is because, just as in Iran, the military in Egypt had lots of economic interests in the country and had its position and status to defend. Similarly, if the scale would increase and the regime in Iran would feel really threatened, I think that that's a card they still have to play with, to bring the Revolutionary Guards into the political equation, and organize a transition that would bring some social changes but maintain the authoritarian elements of the system. And then moving to the comparison between now and the 1978-79 revolution, I think one important difference is that the monarchy at that time, the Shah, was ruling Iran with a very tiny elite. It was the Shah and people among around him, right? But the Islamic Republic in the last 4 decades has created a huge elite that is absolutely in the middle of it, the supreme leader, the president, and so on. But around it, a huge bureaucracy. Around it, the military authorities. And all of these people have a lot to lose. And therefore, this is the second difference. When the regime of the Shah was, few people came to its defense. They tried to organize counter demonstrations, but these were really small and insignificant. In these current protests, we do see that even at the universities, they are trying to mobilize their own pro-state demonstrations immediately after the demonstration started, and then again on 4th of November, they organized demonstrations that were in the tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people. So there is a significant minority that is defending this state, and also this state has a loyal military force. Therefore, I don't think any revolutionary movement now will be as quick as it was in 1978. It will be a marathon. It will be a long series of protests and struggles with ebbs and flows in the movement, and the movement learning from these experiences and organizing and creating its own leaders. And this is the third difference, because at the time of the revolution, there was some embryonic organization around the clerics that could grow into a leading force. And there were also organizations of the left, of liberals, and so on. Currently, the state has really weakened those organizations. So we need a reemergence of organizations from within this protest in Iran. Any organization outside of Iran can only give solidarity and amplify the voices of Iranians. But what is needed is really organization on the streets in Iran as well.
Absolutely. Now, I, would like to ask you to become a future teller by telling us where do you think these protests might be headed, and where might Iran be headed in the coming weeks, if not months? Um, is there a trajectory that you find more plausible than others?
Right.
Will this be another sort of disappointing situation where everything's wrapped up and things are back to quote unquote normal and to the status quo ante? Or might there be signs that provide hope for such movements in Iran and changes which might actually have reverberations in the region?
Right. Well, Bassam, for a historian, it's really always difficult to come with these kind of predictions. But this is an important issue, and I think for the movement and everybody observing it, is a central question. So I would like to discuss it more in terms of scenarios that are plausible and I do see in front of me. One is obviously still of this movement being victorious, because I think it is really mobilizing lots of energy, creativity, and you can see that in the movement, the protest songs, the graffitis, the art performances, the creativity in terms of action repertoires, the flash mob protests to divide the forces of the regime and organize at neighborhood levels, right? Trying to instigate strikes. Um, those are all hopeful signs that this movement is very creative. People are already having their networks, and we are in the eighth week, and despite all that repression, people are going forward. So this might continue, and as I said, with ebbs and flows, to you know undermine the credibility of the state, undermine further its legitimacy and its repressive power, and force on it cracks that might bring a change down the line. I cannot foresee how long that will take, but I do think that is a very plausible uh, outcome. The emergence of a democracy that can actually establish political freedoms and social equality at its heart. But there is also a terrible scenario that is maybe possible as well at the other end of the spectrum, that this kind of the protest can actually topple the regime, but force the regime to implode, and not the regime and not the movement being strong enough to kind of impose their own order, and therefore this could be followed by chaos and long-term infighting, etc. And I hope that scenario obviously will not materialize, but I don't think we can disregard it totally, because we have seen that happen elsewhere as well. And the third scenario could be that the regime is victorious, right? And that it kind of cracks down on these protests, um, introduces some concessions or not, and then continues meddling through. And then we will see in the future more protests rising up because the grievances have not been addressed. And the fourth scenario I already briefly mentioned is that if the life of the state is really threatened, that these protests would continue. At one point, the Revolutionary Guards might step uh, in a scenario of a semi-military coup to take over power and introduce some social reforms, but maintain their own political and economic interests and the more authoritarian framework of the state. I think it would be a difficult scenario to materialize, because Iran does not have that military coup experience. There is a bureaucracy to push back against that. People will push back against it. But I do think if the situation would deteriorate for the state, that this scenario would become plausible as well.
Thank you, Payman, for this really rich conversation and answers that clarify what is going on today and sort of expand our horizons as to the possibilities, both in space and time, because we also benefit from the comparisons that you provided with the Arab uprisings and the 1979 revolution, as well as the potential for more mass-based mobilization. And there's no I don't think this is a puzzle as to what most of us are hoping for in this context. And I look forward to speaking with you again, hopefully under better circumstances. But before I let you go, are there any sort of parting words or any last comments you'd like to share?
No, just I want to resonate your hope that I really also hope that this movement will be successful and we will see an Iran with a bright future, and also building of solidarity networks with countries in the region and globally, because we are, I think, at a crucial moment in history where we are seeing in imperial tensions increasing between the U.S., China. We have the war between Ukraine and Russia. We are having an economic crisis at the horizon. And I do think that people need to enter the framework to kind of change the political horizons in front of us, because otherwise we will have a repetition of what we had for the last decades, and that has actually produced the Islamic Republic in Iran and has produced the kind of politics that has reinforced it rather than undermining it.
Thank you. All right. Well, we are going to continue our work with discussing important topics with various people that you really want to hear from on this podcast titled Flow, which is actually the inaugural podcast. And we are honored and we're honored and very pleased to have had Professor Peyman Jafari as our first guest. And I hope everyone sticks around. Feel free to subscribe, because that will allow us to do more in terms of privileges of broadcasting and so on. And let me just say that this particular podcast was co-sponsored by the Shar School of Policy and Government at George Mason, as well as the Middle East and Islamic Studies program, also at George Mason, and the Arab Studies Institute. Thank you very much, Peyman, and best wishes to you, and I hope we speak with you soon. Until
Thank you for
then,
the conversation, Bassam.
thank you, my friend. Until then, goodbye.